This is Curt Curtis, and this is a painting class I taught at the Syracuse Guild for the Visual Arts a year or so ago. This is a photograph that we used as a source for the painting that we did as a group. The audio is a little difficult here, but I hope you enjoy it. This is everything you want to know or didn't want to know about the way I paint. And if you've been coming to these kind of demonstrations and workshops for a while, I really don't think you'll hear anything earth-shattering or new. But for me anyway, whenever I go to a class or try to watch somebody, I'm always trying to learn something to help me. I'm very simple-minded in the sense that I like to, I want to know how to do it. I want it to be fairly well described and easy to repeat, that kind of thing. So all I've really done is just taken all the ideas that I hear that I agree with and see value in and tried to put them together in a way that is easy for me to remember and understand. Okay? So, here we go. Now, the first thing I would look at is this first line. It's kind of highlighted here very lightly, but it's kind of, in my mind, sort of the overall process of creating art. And we're only going to focus today on painting, but there's a few things you have to do before you ever get to trying to put, colors on a board. And so the first thing in my mind is what some people call the concept. And some artists value that phase more than others. Some people never even talk about it. Other people, make it sound as though it's the most important thing about art. And it's all about, what are you going to paint? Why are you painting? What are you trying to accomplish? And I'm not going to talk at all about that, but you kind of have to have decided, what are you going to do and why? And I've picked the subject. So I've kind of done all of that for us. Okay. The next thing you have to do, or at least that I try to do, is to work out a composition. Composition is a whole other subject we're not going to talk about today. But it's, has a lot to do with designing the picture. Where are you going to put things? Do you want, want the picture to be bright and, or do you want it to be sort of dull and sultry? I mean, that's all about composition. And I try to work that out typically in a sketch. Thumbnail sketches just in black and white before I ever get to painting. Again, I'm not going to talk about that today. I've made a lot of those decisions for you in the subject, but you really ought to do that. You need to do that before you start painting. Otherwise, I think you miss a big part of the process. And then you finally get to painting, which is what we're going to focus on today. And we'll pick landscapes as the topic because that's our assigned topic for the month. But even when you look at painting, okay, in my mind, and this was a bit of a surprise to me when I first started painting, I was just excited to get the colors on the canvas. And the first thing that became painfully obvious to me is half of painting is mixing colors. You spend half your time preparing a color, and then at best, the other half of your time putting it on the canvas. And I was not prepared for that. I really wasn't. And some artists get around the whole color mixing thing by using a very extensive palette. There are lots of colors. In fact, one of the artists that came to teach us last year, he did just that. He had every color. It was kind of like he was opening a pastel box. He had all these colors on his palette, and then all he had to do was pick the closest color and then just modify it, make it lighter or darker. And that's how he painted. And I found that very limiting for two reasons. First of all, I kind of implied it before, I'm rather cheap. So, I wasn't going to buy a lot of expensive paints, and I don't buy a lot of paints. And the other thing is I really wanted to understand the theory of color. And so that's where we're going to talk first. It's about color mixing. That's the first part of painting. And so I made this little handout. At this point in the course, I introduced this little handout, which I'm sharing with you now in the video. I wanted you to have a chance to look at it a bit before you hear me trying to describe how it's used or what it represents in the class itself. It's basically laid out with a representation of the color wheel and where the colors I use fall on the color wheel, followed by some sense for how those colors show up on a value scale, followed by the layout that I use actually on the physical palette. I'll start the easiest thing to relate to with my setup. Okay, if you look here at my palette, you see that I've got the colors laid out just as I've laid them out there on the handout from left to right. Basically, it's my lightest colors to my darkest colors. And very, very limited palette. I call it a modified split primary palette. Now, I don't know if you guys in the classes, if you remember people talking about split palettes, but a split primary palette is organized around the three primary colors. And I'll try to describe on this handout why I'm sold on the idea of a split primary palette as being the very best way to approach color mixing. And you guys can decide for yourself whether it makes sense.
Now, in place of watching me talk, I'm going to try to use the visuals that are in the handout to show you or better illustrate the concepts that I'm trying to describe to the people who are in the class. So hopefully this helps.
The basic idea is that when you try to buy colors that are manufactured, you're not going to be able to find a pure color. There's not a pure blue, red, or yellow. So when you start mixing them, the pure theory of color mixing doesn't work very well because I call it the impurities in the pigments that make the blue not quite an exact blue. It's going to affect when you start mixing your colors. And so what they've done to compensate is they split the primary colors, that's red, yellow, and blue, into a warm and a cool. And so I've laid them out on the color wheel on this handout with the warm and cool color on either side of the primary colors. So if you look down here at the yellow, for example, the yellow that is warm, meaning that it leans towards red, it's cadmium yellow. At least in the Winton colors that I buy, that's a fairly warm yellow. If you look at it, it's tending towards orange, right? The other one is the cadmium yellow pale, which it's a cool color, meaning that it's leaning towards the blue on the color wheel. And you can see that it has no red in it at all, and just a little bit of blue. Just barely starting to tend towards the cool side. And I've done that, or in any split primary palette, you see they do the same thing. So if you go around on the reds, my cool red, meaning that it's leaning towards the blue, is the alizarin crimson. Right? The warm one, the one that leans towards the yellow, is the cadmium red. And then on the blue side, the ultramarine blue and phthalo blue. Now, you'll notice that even though I believe in a split primary palette, you can mix almost any color from this kind of a palette. But I don't use all the colors in a split primary palette, at least that's what I found. So the ones that are missing, if you look, which ones, and I have them and I use them, but when I paint landscapes, I don't often put them on my palette because they don't get used. And the ones that I don't use are the phthalo blue and the cadmium red. And I think the reason that I don't use them when I'm painting landscapes, painting nature, natural colors, trying to replicate nature, is that the closer any of these colors are to each other, the more intense or bright a color they mix. So if I was to mix an orange, the brightest orange that I can mix in a split primary palette is with the yellow that leans towards red and the red that leans towards yellow. I mix those together, there's no blue in either of those colors. So when I mix them together, I get a very intense orange. Unfortunately, if you look at nature, nature has very few intense oranges to offer us. So I don't use it very often, this color. And the same is with the blue. The phthalo blue is also a very strong color, right? The tinting strength is very strong. But the main reason I think I don't use it is that, there are very few intense greens. That may surprise you, but when we start mixing the colors, you see almost every green you see in nature, as intense a color as it appears to you, is always something less than the brightest green you can mix on a true palette. So I dropped those two colors. The other colors make this color gamut that you can see here that I've highlighted. These are all the colors that I can mix with the primary colors that I've kept from the split primary palette. And it's more than enough for what I'm doing, you can do in nature. The only other modification is that I've added the burnt umber. And if you see where it kind of fits, I believe it's an orange with a very low intensity. So if you probably wondered what a brown was, browns are always oranges or reds that just have no chroma, just no intensity. And one of the reasons I love to use burnt umber in nature is that there are lots of browns in nature, but also it allows me, with any of these colors, to, in my mixing, to make it less intense. Right? And you make a color less intense by adding its complement. So if you want to tone down the blue, you add an orange. Well, my burnt umber serves as an orange for the blue. And on the red, what do you add red to tone it down? A green. Well, I don't have a pure green, so I'll end up adding a blue and yellow to tone it down. And the yellows, the opposite of the yellow is a purple. And I mix a little of those to tone down the yellows if I need to. Okay. Yet, now, the other nice thing that I like about this particular palette is highlighted here with the value scale. And that is that you see it gives me 3 darks and 3 lights, which give me a lot of options for such a limited palette. So I can, if I need to change the value and make it lighter, I've got 3 choices to pick from. If I need to make it darker, I still have 3 choices to pick from. So whether you like it or not, this is the palette I use. This is why I use it, and in my view, it's a pretty good approach. I mean, it makes sense based on everything I've heard and what I've heard people describe.
I changed gears here a little bit in the class and began talking not about the layout of my colors or why I use the colors I use, but more about my approach to mixing the color that I need to have to place on the on the picture to begin my painting. And so that's what you'll hear next.
When it comes to color mixing, the first thing I think about is the hue, okay? Hue is the color you see on the color wheel, right? Is it red, yellow, green? What's the color? That's referred to as the hue. That's the first thing I worry about because that's the first thing I need to know. If it's going to basically be a purple, then I need to know that I'm going to put my blue and my red together, right? So hue is the first thing you have to think about. What color am I trying to make? The second thing, after you've made the basic color from your primaries, is intensity. You look at the color and you have to say, is it some people call it bright and dull. Those are the terms that I put on the handout. I think a better way to think of it is whether it's intense, a color, or muted or dirty, kind of a muddy color. So like when you look at nature, this is probably one of the hardest things to do, is to see the color. Some things are obvious, like the greens, right? But when you're looking at this path, what color is it? Don't tell me brown, because brown is not a color, right? What color is it? You have to decide first the hue. So you say, well, it's either a red tending towards orange, or it's an orange maybe tending a little toward red, right? That's the hue. So that's the first thing you need to know when mixing a color, because that tells me I start with, if I'm right, if it's a red tending towards orange, I start with the red, and then I'm going to mix it with something that brings it towards the orange, which is either one of the yellows, or brown as an orange might work too. But you kind of need to know the hue first. And then the second thing when you look at this color is this is not intense. If you compare it to an intense, bright orange, you know that it's not, you've got to tone it down a lot. And the way you tone down a color, like we said, is to add its complement. So I'm going to have to take that reddish orange, and I'm going to have to, put in a greenish blue to bring it down to make that color brown. Right? That's the intensity. So what's the hue? First thing you have to worry about. Second, what's the intensity of the color? And then the last thing, even though it's the most important thing, the last thing is what's the value? Now, the reason I do it last is because it is most important. So whether I got the hue right, whether I got the intensity exactly right, that'll be okay as long as I get the value right. Because the value is the most important thing. Value is how light or how dark the color. And of course, most of your adjustments that way are by adding lights or adding darks. So when it comes to color mixing, that's the 3-step process. What's the hue? Make the hue. How intense is the color? Modify the color to match the intensity as best you can. And then lastly, what's the value? Make it that match the value right. And then you're done. So that first stage of painting, which we call color mixing, is just that simple.